In our first reading from Ecclesiastes, which is not known to be the most joyful book of the Bible, what we hear is that all things are vanity, right? And so for us, that doesn't mean that all things are, when we think of someone who is vain about sort of this high opinion of themselves and that kind of thing, really think of it more in terms of it's all done in vain. Like there's not a purpose behind it. It doesn't have value or meaning, which some have also said that Ecclesiastes is kind of like the bad news that prepares us for the good news of Jesus Christ, right? We know the condition of humanity, our human condition, and without God, it is meaningless and purposeless, is what Ecclesiastes tries to tell us. In the gospel reading, of course, we also have the story of the rich man who goes about with a bountiful harvest and tries to really save up the grain for himself, and then finds out that he is going now to really die, right? That God's holding him accountable for that. In those two things, we can think about our mortality and the transitional nature of all things, right? So that everything in this world is passing away, and we ourselves will one day pass through the doorway of death. Those two things don't seem to be great divine revelation to me, right? They're kind of folk wisdom. We know it ourselves when we say, oh, you can't take it with you. Right? There's kind of this sense of that. And I would like to delve a little bit deeper into what maybe God is telling us about his divine revelation through the gospel reading in particular. And that's really going to be about covenant. Everybody say covenant. So we're going to delve a little bit more deeply in this homily into the idea of covenant and how the rich man really severs covenants, relationships that he has as he goes about doing his business. I also just wanted to say it's good to be home, right? It's good to be back with you all. I was able to go out to Colorado for about 3 days and visit with my dad and then join one of our two. We had two crews from our scout troop that went to a high adventure base called Philmont Scout Ranch in northern New Mexico. One did a 5-day backpacking trek, and the other one, the one that I was on, that we did a 10-day in the backcountry backpacking trek in which we hiked 87 trail miles. I'm glad to be back in one piece. And I just want to say, like, if you and I ever have an opportunity to spend any extended time together, and we do that, and like the scouts that were on this trek, I should always come with a disclaimer. Anything you say or do can show up in a homily. So we were on the trek, and I'll get a little bit more into the trek, but it was a great experience. And on the 4th day on the trail, we were able to cross paths. So our itineraries went in opposite directions, and we met on the trail, which was a surprise to the boys. And we had Mass on the trail. So I brought my Mass kit, and we were able to have the Eucharist there on the side of the trail. And when we did that, I'm always reminded of St. John Paul II, who said that every celebration of the Eucharist is celebrated, in a sense, on the altar of the world, right? That it always comes from what is created, that we offer divine worship to God. And so that's very poignantly visible when you do a Mass on the side of the trail. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that experience in just a moment. But I wanted to talk about covenant and what that covenant is. And so as we think about the rich man severing covenant relationships, we should know what a covenant means. And so most prominently in our society, in our church, we think of a covenant when we think about marriage, that marriage is a covenant. And so a husband and wife are not preparing for marriage in a sense of preparing for a contract between two parties. They are entering into a union. So they give themselves 100% to the other and receive the other 100% to themselves, and that creates a new entity. Something new happens, as new is created. And that sense of covenant is really based out of the Old Testament and the Jewish tradition of God giving himself to his people and God's people becoming his people, giving themselves to God. Right? So those two things happen, that kind of exchange, and something new is created. Of course, the new covenant is in Jesus' blood, and the new covenant where Jesus has given himself completely to us and we give ourselves completely to him, now creates a new entity, the body of Christ. Right? We are his body, and that's the new thing that is created. So in the Old Testament, oftentimes a covenant relationship between God and his people would have a covenantal sign. And so a covenantal sign in the Old Testament might be something like taking a bull and slicing it down the middle, laying both halves of the carcass out on the ground, collecting the blood, burning half the blood on the altar, and sprinkling the other half of the blood on the people. We don't do that anymore. Our covenantal sign is the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That covenantal sign is the greatest mystery of our faith. It is what is made present on our altar every time we celebrate the Eucharist, that Jesus has given himself completely for us on the cross and has been raised from the dead, and that offers us life in him. So when we come here, we renew our covenant with God every Eucharist, every time we come here, and so that becomes made present for us, the mystery of the Paschal mystery on the altar, that we enter into that covenantal sign with Christ. The rich man in today's gospel really severs covenantal relationships. And so I wanted to go through what those are so we can better understand what we're being called to. And so the first covenantal relationship that he severs is the relationship with creation. So God has made creation. In the Old Testament covenants, he promises his people a land, right? And so the rich man in today's gospel thinks of that land as his own, not as a gift from God. And that the bountiful harvest is a result of his efforts, not the gift of God, right? And so in some ways, his relationship is not one of gratitude for what God has provided, but is a self-sufficiency of what he has done himself, right? So he severs the relationship in what creation is meant to be, this good gift of God for us. And so we can think of that in terms of our own abilities or talents or relationships or careers or the other pieces of our natural lives that God has given to us, and we should offer some gratitude for. The second covenantal relationship is the relationship with the community. So you recognize that the rich man has as a horizon his own self-interest, right? He is not interested in anyone besides himself when he has this bountiful harvest. So instead of, we have a bountiful harvest, what a wonderful thing for us, it becomes, we have a bountiful harvest, what a wonderful thing for me. And instead of being able to be a source of being able to help the needy and those who are struggling or anything else, it becomes about asset management for this guy. Right? How am I going to create bigger barns so that I can place my assets in a place where they're safe and protected for myself? And so we need to recognize that our community responsibility, our covenant with the community, is that we are responsible for our brothers. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers. Right? We have a responsibility to give of our abundance and what we have received in order to help those who are in need. The third one is the covenantal relationship is really the covenantal relationship with himself, right? So do you know, and it says this in the second reading, do you know whose image you're made in? God's image, right? You are made in God's image, and you have a divine spark in you, and part of that relationship with God burns within you. You've got a divine energy within you. And if you keep as the horizon of your life your own self-interests, that will never be fulfilled, right? We need others. We need love. We need to be able to give of ourselves and move beyond our own personal self-interests in order for that divine life to catch fire and burn within us. And so he breaks the covenant with himself in that he does not allow himself to be who God made him to be. The fourth one is the relationship with God. And I don't know if you noticed, but God showed up in the story, right? After all of his asset management, the rich man, feeling pretty confident in himself, said, I'm going to be able to eat, drink, and be merry. And then the auditor showed up, right? And the auditor demanded an accounting, and that his very life would be taken from him that evening, right? Our relationship with God becomes the fundamental covenantal relationship of our lives. Everything else revolves around that. It orders our lives in an appropriate order so that the things that are important, the things from above, as St. Paul tells us, are the things that matter in our hearts, in our minds, and in our lives. And so as we come to this Eucharist, those covenantal relationships apply to us with creation, with community, with ourselves, and with God. And as you recall, this is the moment of that divine exchange of the covenantal renewal. Now, I said I was going to talk a little bit more about the trek, and I will just briefly. So for 2 days, as we led up to the day we had Mass on the trail, we were hiking through a burn scar. So about 7 years ago, Philmont had a wildfire that consumed about 25% of their 140,000 plus acres. And so it's very interesting to walk through that burn scar, but it is very exposed. There are no trees, there is no shade, there is no protection, right? You're going through this sort of desolate looking area, and we did that for about 2 days. And yet, you see all around you the signs of new life, the signs of new vegetation, of new animals. In fact, on one of those days, we ended up seeing 13 elk come down the hillside, right? It was a very important, significant sign of, in nature, the Paschal mystery, about how destruction and death leads to new life. It is that pattern and that great mystery that we celebrate, that the Paschal mystery of Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection, again, is made present for us and invites us into the renewal of our covenant relationships with creation, with community, with ourselves, and with God. So this Eucharist is the invitation for us to assess our covenantal relationships. How are we doing in each of those areas? What are the areas that we may be called to increase our gift of ourselves to God as we receive from Him all that He has given us? And so this becomes a moment in response to the readings for us to really look at how are we living out our covenantal relationships with creation, with community, with ourselves, and with God. And as we do that this morning, in the words of the responsorial psalm, if today you hear His voice, harden not your hearts.